The snow came earlier than expected that year, falling thick and silent over the plains of northern Texas. By the time Mara stumbled down the icy hillside with her son in her arms, the wind had already covered their tracks. She didn't look back. Behind her lay nothing she wished to remember. A house that once belonged to her husband, now full of cold stares and clenched fists, and a family that treated her like an unwanted burden the moment he died. It had started with whispers, then chores without rest, then bruises that couldn't be hidden beneath sleeves, until finally they said the words aloud. "You and that boy don't belong here." So she left. Mara's boots were soaked through. Her coat, thin and borrowed, did little to fight the bitter wind. Her son, Ben, just 6 years old, clung to her neck, his breath shallow against her skin. They had nowhere to go. No one in town would take them in. Not after the rumors spread by her in-laws that she was cursed, that the child wasn't truly her husband's, that she brought shame, lies, all of it. But lies that stuck harder than truth in a place like this. The sun began to set, washing the snow-covered land in shades of silver and blue. Mara's knees buckled as she reached the edge of a frozen stream, her body refusing to move another inch. She collapsed to the ground, shielding Ben as best she could beneath her tattered shawl. She didn't pray. She'd stopped doing that months ago. Instead, she whispered into her son's ear, "I'm sorry, baby, I tried." And then she closed her eyes. The sound of hooves came slow and soft, like a drumbeat through the snow. Mara didn't hear them, but Ben did. The boy stirred, his small hand reaching from beneath the shawl to the sound. Through his blurred vision, he saw a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted by the gray sky. A man, wrapped in furs, long hair caught in the wind, eyes sharp, watchful. He dismounted silently, kneeling beside them. His hand hovered just above Mara's shoulder, unsure whether to touch. "You alive?" he asked in a deep, calm voice. Mara didn't move. He turned to the boy. "You cold?" Ben nodded. The man didn't speak again. He lifted Mara gently, careful not to jostle her. Then he scooped the boy into his other arm and walked back toward his horse. That night, in a warm shelter deep in the pines, lit by fire and smelling faintly of herbs and smoke, Mara opened her eyes to the sound of crackling wood and the low voice of a man speaking in a language she didn't understand. When her eyes adjusted, she saw him, sitting by the fire, sharpening a blade, calm, still, watching her without fear and without pity. "You'll live," he said. Mara's lips trembled. "Why did you help us?" He didn't answer right away. He tossed another log on the fire, sparks dancing upward. "Because I've seen wolves circle what's weak," he said, "and I've seen the weak stand back up." Mara awoke to warmth, not just the fire, but blankets, thick, heavy, hand-woven. The scent of cedar surrounded her, and nearby Ben slept peacefully, his small chest rising and falling beneath a fur-lined wrap. Her hands, cracked and raw from the cold, had been bandaged. Someone had cleaned the blood from her cheek. She sat up slowly, groaning as pain settled back into her bones. Across the room, the man stirred but didn't speak. He crouched near a low table, grinding something in a wooden bowl. "You saved us," she said hoarsely. He glanced over. "You needed saving." His voice was calm, rough like wind over stone, but not unkind. She hesitated. "Who are you?" He stood slowly. "Name's Tovani, Comanche." Mara's breath caught. Back where she came from, folks didn't speak the name with respect. Fear, suspicion, those were more common. But this man had carried her through snow, fed her son, and asked for nothing. Still, the weight of habit made her whisper, "Should I be afraid?" Tovani looked her dead in the eye. "If you were mine to hurt, you wouldn't be here." There was no threat in his tone, just truth. Over the next few days, Mara and Ben recovered in the small log shelter, nestled deep in the pines. Tovani moved through the space with quiet efficiency. He rarely spoke unless needed, but every action was deliberate. He left water near the bed each morning. He cooked stew over the fire and always served the child first. When Ben laughed at something, the sight of a fox outside the window, or the way Tovani muttered to himself while cooking, it was the first time Mara had heard her son laugh in months. At night, she listened to the wind outside and thought about what they had escaped. Her husband's family, their coldness, their lies, the way they had smiled while pushing her away with words that cut deeper than any blade. "You're nothing without him. You've always been trouble. That child doesn't belong to our name." She pulled Ben closer each night, heart aching. On the fourth morning, As Mara washed a pot near the stream behind the shelter, Tovani approached with a fresh rabbit. "You're strong," he said. She blinked. "I don't feel strong." "Doesn't mean it ain't true." She stared at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" He shrugged. "Kindness ain't the same as weakness. Where I'm from, helping someone survive is just what people do." She looked away, tears burning behind her eyes. "No one's helped me in a long time." "Then maybe it's time someone did." That evening, after Ben fell asleep, Mara sat by the fire while Tovani smoked a carved pipe. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but easy. But she broke it. "I don't know where we'll go when we leave." He didn't look at her. "Then don't leave yet." She met his gaze. "Why not?" "Because winter's still out there," he said, flicking ash into the fire. "And you ain't done healing." Mara didn't answer, but she didn't pack her things either. And in that decision, unspoken but real, was the first seed of something more than safety. It was trust. The days blurred softly into one another. The snow outside deepened, but inside the shelter, warmth took root, not just in the fire but in small unspoken gestures. Mara had begun helping with the cooking, carefully seasoning Tovani's stews until he finally muttered, "Not bad," which she took as high praise. Ben, no longer afraid to speak, followed Tovani like a shadow, eager to learn how to tie knots, scrape hides, and mimic the hunter's quiet confidence. One morning, Mara found the boy practicing how to walk silently across the floor, copying Tovani's steps. "He says the snow listens," Ben whispered proudly. "So I gotta be quiet." She smiled, brushing hair from his brow. "Sounds like someone's turning into a brave scout." Ben beamed. Later that day, while Tovani sharpened an arrowhead, Mara sat beside him and said, "You teach him without trying." He didn't look up. "That's how the best learning happens." She hesitated, watching the steady motion of his hands. "Were you always alone out here?" "Not always," he said quietly, "but long enough." His answer made her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. That evening, snow fell in thick sheets outside. The fire crackled low as Ben slept curled against a pile of furs. Mara sat close to the flames, drying herbs Tovani had gathered earlier. He watched her with a gaze that didn't wander but lingered, respectful, but waited. "You never asked about what happened to us," she said after a while. "I figured you'd say when ready," he replied. She nodded. "I was married. He died in a cattle accident. His family said I cursed him, that Ben wasn't his son. They lied, but they made it sound true." Tovani's brow furrowed. "And no one stood up for you?" "Not a soul," she whispered. "They said we weren't worth the name he gave us." He said nothing for a long moment. "Then, his name didn't protect you. Maybe it wasn't worth much." Mara blinked, startled by the simplicity of it. "Names are only good if they're backed by truth," he added. She let out a long breath. "Then I guess I need a new one." He finally looked at her. "Maybe you just need a place where no one asks for proof." The silence between them shifted. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space, a clearing in the woods of their hearts, quiet, open, waiting to be filled. The next morning, as Mara stepped outside, she found a new pair of boots waiting near the door. Hand-stitched, small, just Ben's size. She picked them up, blinking back sudden tears. Inside, Tovani was already tending to the fire like nothing had changed. But it had. By the time the snow began to soften, so had Mara's fear. The deep frost that had once lived in her bones, the ache of abandonment, the terror of never being wanted again, had started to thaw. She didn't notice it all at once. It was in the way she laughed when Ben spilled porridge across the table, or how her fingers no longer trembled when she laced up her boots. It was in the way she began to hum while gathering herbs, in the way she looked Tovani in the eyes and didn't flinch. One crisp morning, she asked if she could learn to track. "Toe, the way you do," she added with a smile. Tovani didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. "You got quiet feet?" he asked. She raised a brow. "Used to, before I was carrying fear everywhere." He considered that for a long beat. "Then let's go find your quiet again." They set out together, Ben left behind in the warm care of an elder Tovani occasionally visited nearby. It was the first time Mara had been beyond the edge of the pines in months. The forest opened around her like a promise. Tovani showed her how to read the prints of deer in half-melted snow, how to spot the subtle bend of grass where a rabbit had passed. His voice was calm, low, never impatient. She tried, failed, tried again. By midday, she managed to find the trail of a fox. He said nothing but handed her a piece of dried meat as reward. She laughed. "This is your version of applause?" He almost smiled. "Better than clapping." On their way back, they paused near a ridge overlooking the valley below. Mara sat on a flat rock, brushing hair from her eyes. "You've given us so much," she said softly, "and you don't even know who we are." "I know enough," he replied. Mara looked at him. "I used to think people like me weren't meant to survive this world. That the ones with no family, no name, no money, we were just meant to disappear." He met her gaze, steady as always. "You didn't disappear, you endured. That matters." Back at the shelter, Ben ran out to greet them, new boots thudding on soft ground. His face lit up when he saw Mara. "Mama, did you see a bear?" She laughed, lifting him into her arms. "No bears today, just foxes and snow and quiet." Tovani watched them from a distance, his arms folded, expression unreadable. But in the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly, she knew he was starting to care, even if he didn't say it. That night, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the wooden walls, Mara whispered to herself a truth she hadn't dared speak aloud. This feels like the beginning of something, and she wasn't wrong. The cold finally gave way to softer winds and melting snow. Spring arrived not with a trumpet, but with the gentlest hush, moss greening on tree trunks, birds returning to the pines, and the sound of river water finally running free again. And with it came something new inside Mara. Not just survival, not just shelter, belonging. Ben thrived. His cheeks regained color, and his eyes lit up at the mention of traps, trails, or anything that involved following Tovani through the trees. He began calling him Mr. Toe out of ease, though the hunter never corrected him. One morning, Mara found the two of them carving small animals out of softwood. Ben's fox looked more like a potato, but he was proud nonetheless. "He's happy," she said softly as she approached. Tovani looked up. Children don't lie with their smiles. She sat down beside them. "Neither do grown people if they're lucky." He handed her a carving knife. "You want to learn too?" She looked at the blade, then at him, a little surprised. "I think I do." As days warmed, so did the space between them. Mara found herself standing a little closer when they walked the stream beds. She asked about his past, not out of curiosity, but care. And slowly, piece by piece, he shared. He had once been part of a small Comanche band driven further west by settlers. His father had taught him to track, to live off the land. But war and betrayal had taken many. Since then, he lived alone, keeping distance from towns and people alike. "Sometimes the land understands better than men do," he told her one evening. Mara looked at the mountains in the distance and nodded. "The land didn't turn its back on me." "Neither did you," she didn't say aloud. But somehow he heard it anyway. One night, after Ben had fallen asleep and the wind outside was soft with pine scent, Mara lingered by the fire while Tovani added kindling. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she admitted. Tovani said nothing at first, then, "You don't owe me for that." "I know," she said, "but I want you to know it matters." He looked into the flames, then slowly turned to her. "Then let me tell you something too," he said. "I don't usually make space for anyone in my world. I did for you." She swallowed, heart tightening. "Why?" He didn't blink. "Because you didn't break, even when you were meant to." In that moment, something passed between them. Not a promise, not a confession, but the beginning of something unspoken, real, and growing. The cabin no longer felt like a place borrowed from fate. It felt like home. Mara found herself humming again while sweeping the floors, folding laundry by the fire, or kneading flatbread at the old table Tovani had carved long before she arrived. The walls, once so foreign, now held echoes of laughter. Ben's drawings were pinned above his bed, shaky figures of foxes, bows, and 3 smiling stick people holding hands. Tovani had noticed, and it terrified him more than a snowstorm ever could. One warm afternoon, while Ben napped, and the air outside smelled of pine and spring water, Tovani handed Mara a freshly cut sapling with strong roots and soft green leaves. "For the west wall," he said. "It'll bloom come summer." Mara cradled it carefully. "You're planting trees now?" "Things deserve to grow where they're safe," he said simply. She blinked. "Are we talking about plants or people?" He didn't answer, just handed her the shovel. That evening, after the planting, they sat quietly on the porch. The stars blinked slowly into view, the kind of sky that only comes when everything else is still. Mara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and said, "You ever think about leaving all this?" He exhaled through his nose. "Used to. Thought if I stayed moving, nothing could catch me. Pain, memory, people." She turned to him. "And now?" Tovani looked at her, really looked. "Now I wonder if standing still is how things finally heal." The words hung in the air between them, heavy but gentle. Mara shifted a little closer. "You've given Ben more than anyone ever has. A place to be safe. A role model. A quiet kind of love." Tovani's jaw worked, as if he wanted to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, He reached into his pocket and handed her something. Small, smooth, and wooden. It was a carving. A mother holding a child. Her fingers trembled as she turned it in her hand. "You made this?" He nodded. "Weeks ago. Wasn't sure when to give it." "Why now?" Tavani's voice was steady but low, because today felt like a day that deserved truth. She didn't speak. She leaned forward and placed her hand gently over his. Not a declaration, not a demand. Just a touch that said, "I see you, I trust you, I'm still here." Inside, Ben stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. Outside, two people sat in silence, no longer strangers, no longer just survivors, but something far more rare. Partners in the growing. The first time Mara wore her hair down in front of Tovani, it wasn't on purpose. The tie had slipped while she was chopping onions, and a strand fell over her cheek. She reached to fix it, then paused when she noticed his eyes lingering, not in the way other men had looked at her before, but with quiet wonder, like he was witnessing something fragile unfold and didn't dare interrupt. "You ever wear it like that before?" he asked. She shrugged, suddenly aware of herself. "Used to, before." Tovani nodded once. "You should again, it suits you." It was the kind of compliment that didn't try to charm, only to honor, and it stayed with her the rest of the day. Ben had begun calling the shelter our place. Not the cabin, not the house, just ours. Tovani didn't correct him. In fact, when they passed through a small settlement to trade, and someone asked whose boy he was, Tovani simply placed a hand on Ben's shoulder and said, "He's with me." Ben smiled so wide it nearly broke Mara's heart. She said nothing at the time, but that night, after the boy had fallen asleep, she turned to Tovani beneath the moonlight outside the cabin. "You didn't have to say that," he met her eyes, "but I meant it." Days later, while mending one of Ben's shirts, Mara spoke softly, more to herself than anyone else. "I never imagined someone would make space for me and my child." Tovani was cleaning fish at the table, but he paused. "You aren't extra," he said. "You're the reason the place feels full." She looked up, hands frozen mid-seam. "You ever think about what happens after the thaw?" she asked. He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth, thinking for a long while. "Most winters I've waited out," he said. "This one, I didn't want to end." That night, the rain came, not heavy, but steady. It tapped gently on the roof as Mara sat with Ben beside the fire, brushing his damp hair back as he drifted into sleep. Tovani entered quietly, carrying an old blanket. Without a word, he draped it across their shoulders and sat beside them. The fire crackled. Time slowed, and for the first time, Mara rested her head against his shoulder. It was not a moment loud with declarations, no vows, no promises. But in the stillness, something was exchanged. A silent truth. They were no longer passing through each other's lives. They had arrived. Spring brought with it not just warmth, but color. Wild flowers blooming near the creek, bird song threading through the trees, and long afternoons where the sun stayed a little longer, as if reluctant to leave. Ben ran through the field one morning, his laughter echoing like wind chimes on a warm breeze. Mara sat on the cabin steps watching him with quiet pride. Tovani was nearby, whittling a spoon from cedar, eyes flicking now and then toward the boy. "You ever think about staying?" Mara asked. He didn't look up. "I already have." She blinked, caught off guard. "I mean staying for good, like, not just the season." Tovani set the spoon down and met her gaze. "I meant what I said." Later that week, Mara rode into the nearest settlement alone for supplies, her first time doing so since she had left her in-laws behind. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the reins, but she kept her chin up. Ben had drawn her a picture to keep in her pocket. Two stick figures holding hands beside a crooked house. "Us," he'd said proudly, "and Mr. Toad too." She didn't wear a ring, didn't carry a man's name, but she carried something stronger, a new story. Still, whispers trailed behind her in the dry goods store. She heard them. "That's her, the widow, the one that ran with the boy. Heard she lives out near the tribal lands with one of them." Mara paid no mind, not anymore. On her way out, the storekeeper's wife stopped her. "I just wanted to say," the woman said, glancing around, "you look different, better." Mara smiled politely. "I'm just not afraid anymore." When she returned to the cabin, Ben came running barefoot through the grass, a feather tucked behind his ear, dirt on his knees, and joy in his whole being. "Mama, I found a baby bird and didn't even scare it." Tovani followed behind, holding a small wooden cradle in his arms. Mara raised a brow. "What's that for?" He gave a rare grin. "Just in case someone else shows up one day." She blushed before she could stop it. "That's a bold assumption. Call it preparation," he replied. That night, as stars spread across the sky like scattered fireflies, Mara whispered to Tovani, "What would you think if I took your name?" He turned to her, eyes full of quiet warmth. I don't care what name you wear, he said. You've already carved your place here. She smiled. I just want something that says I belong. Tavani reached over and took her hand. You belong, he said, with or without the name. But in her heart she had already taken it, not as a mark of ownership, but as a truth. She was no longer Mara, the outcast. She was Mara of this land, of this home, of this love. The days passed like steady breath, warm, calm, and full of simple purpose. Mara spent her mornings tending a small herb garden behind the cabin, her afternoons teaching Ben how to write letters in the dirt, and her evenings side by side with Tovani, often in silence that spoke more than words ever could. Then one day a rider appeared on the trail. Mara saw the dust long before she saw the man. Her body tensed, instincts sharpened by a life where visitors never meant anything good. Tovani stood beside her on the porch, arms crossed, unmoved. When the rider drew closer, Mara's heart nearly stopped. It was James, her brother-in-law. Same hat, same sneer, same eyes that once looked through her like glass. He stopped several feet away, reining in his horse with the ease of someone who thought the world owed him space. Mara, he said with mock politeness, didn't expect to find you out here. She stood tall, though her hands trembled slightly. You didn't look too hard. James looked past her, eyes narrowing at the sound of Ben's laughter echoing from behind the cabin. So the boy's still with you. Thought he'd be sent off somewhere by now. Tovani stepped forward then, slowly, silently. James blinked. You don't speak to them like that, Tovani said, voice low and controlled. James scoffed. And who are you? Tovani didn't answer with his name. He didn't need to. He simply said, leave. Mara stepped beside him. You're not welcome here. You never were. James leaned back in his saddle, mouth twisting. He ain't your son's real father, you know. Mara didn't flinch. No, but he's the one raising him. That's more than you ever did for anyone. For once, James had no answer. He turned his horse with a muttered curse and rode off into the trees. That night, the cabin was quiet. Ben had gone to bed early, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Mara sat by the fire, staring at the flames, her body still humming with leftover fear. Tovani knelt beside her, placing a cup of tea in her hands. I shouldn't have let him rattle me, she said. You didn't, he replied. You stood. She looked up, eyes shining. I didn't do it alone. Tovani shook his head gently. You never had to. You just didn't know it yet. In that moment, the past lost some of its grip. Mara had faced the very people who once cast her out and stood her ground. Not because she had something to prove, but because she finally believed what she carried inside was worth protecting. And now someone else did too. The next morning, the air felt different. It wasn't colder or warmer, but somehow clearer, like something heavy had finally lifted from the trees, the soil, and the space inside Mara's chest. She stood barefoot on the porch, sipping coffee from a metal tin, watching Ben chase a grasshopper through the grass, his giggles rising like bird calls. Behind her, Tovani emerged with his coat slung over one shoulder and a quiet ease in his step. You slept? He asked. She nodded. Better than I have in years. He glanced at her bare feet. You're not running anymore. No, she said, smiling. I'm not. They spent that day mending fencing near the western edge of the property. Mara worked beside Tovani, handing him tools, brushing dirt from her skirt, stealing glances when he wasn't looking. There was something about the way he worked, calm, grounded, steady, that felt like a shelter in itself. At midday, they rested under the shade of a twisted juniper tree. Ben sat between them eating flatbread and dried berries, proudly explaining the rules of ant watching, which mostly involved not stepping on any. Tovani listened, nodding solemnly. Wise rules. Mara laughed, brushing a smudge from her son's cheek. He's building his own world. Tovani looked at her. You both are. That evening, after Ben fell asleep with a carved bear tucked under his arm, Mara stood by the hearth, watching embers glow low in the fire. She turned to Tovani. You ever think about building something bigger? He raised a brow. You mean more land? She stepped closer. No, I mean a life. Tovani didn't speak for a long moment. Then he took something from his pocket, a small leather pouch. He opened it and held out a silver pendant carved with a feather and a rising sun, symbols she'd come to learn held deep meaning in his people's traditions. It's not a ring, he said, but it's what I have, and I made it with my hands. If you take it, it means you choose to stay. Not because of the boy, not because you owe me anything, just because you want this life, with me. Mara stared at the pendant, heart pounding. Then she reached out and closed his hand around it. I don't need a ring, she said softly. I just need you. Outside, the wind picked up, but it didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like movement, like change, like a door opening instead of closing. Mara leaned her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of the only promise she'd ever truly trusted. A man who showed up and stayed. The next morning, the air felt different. It wasn't colder or warmer, but somehow clearer, like something heavy had finally lifted from the trees, the soil, and the space inside Mara's chest. She stood barefoot on the porch, sipping coffee from a metal tin, watching Ben chase a grasshopper through the grass, his giggles rising like bird calls. Behind her, Tovani emerged with his coat slung over one shoulder and a quiet ease in his step. "You slept?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I have in years." He glanced at her bare feet. "You're not running anymore." "No," she said, smiling. "I'm not." They spent that day mending fencing near the western edge of the property. Mara worked beside Tovani, handing him tools, brushing dirt from her skirt, stealing glances when he wasn't looking. There was something about the way he worked, calm, grounded, steady, that felt like a shelter in itself. At midday, they rested under the shade of a twisted juniper tree. Ben sat between them eating flatbread and dried berries, proudly explaining the rules of ant watching, which mostly involved not stepping on any. Tovani listened, nodding solemnly. "Wise rules." Mara laughed, brushing a smudge from her son's cheek. "He's building his own world." Tovani looked at her. "You both are." That evening, after Ben fell asleep with a carved bear tucked under his arm, Mara stood by the hearth, watching embers glow low in the fire. She turned to Tovani. "You ever think about building something bigger?" He raised a brow. "You mean more land?" She stepped closer. "No, I mean a life." Tovani didn't speak for a long moment. Then he took something from his pocket, a small leather pouch. He opened it and held out a silver pendant carved with a feather and a rising sun. Symbols she'd come to learn held deep meaning in his people's traditions. "It's not a ring," he said, "but it's what I have, and I made it with my hands. If you take it, it means you choose to stay. Not because of the boy, not because you owe me anything, just because you want this life. With me." Mara stared at the pendant, heart pounding. Then she reached out and closed his hand around it. "I don't need a ring," she said softly. "I just need you." Outside, the wind picked up, but it didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like movement, like change, like a door opening instead of closing. Mara leaned her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of the only promise she'd ever truly trusted. A man who showed up and stayed. Spring melted into summer like honey warming over a fire. The land around the cabin buzzed with new life. Bees weaving through blooming sage, birds nesting in the rafters, and Ben's footprints tracking through the soft soil like little pieces of joy left behind. What once felt like a temporary refuge now pulsed with permanence, with belonging. Mara had stopped asking herself if she'd stay. Now she only thought of how to grow what they had. The pendant Tovani had given her hung around her neck every day. She didn't tuck it under her blouse, didn't hide it. It wasn't just a symbol of their bond, it was a declaration of her choice. And every time her fingers brushed it, she remembered that this piece wasn't given. It was fought for. One afternoon, while patching the roof, Tovani called down to her from the rafters. "Should we build another room?" Mara shielded her eyes from the sun. "Why?" He grinned. "Ben said we might have more people someday." She laughed. "Is this his way of asking for a sibling?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he just wants space to teach someone else the ant rules." Later that evening, Ben confirmed it. "I think it'd be nice," he said sleepily as she tucked him in. "If I wasn't the only kid here, I'd share." Mara smiled, smoothing his hair. "Let's see what time brings, little fox." That night, she and Tovani sat outside, the stars sprawling wide and soft above them. The cabin glowed faintly from within, warm with firelight, laughter still echoing faintly from the day. Mara rested her hand on his knee. "You ever think we deserve this?" she asked. Tovani thought for a moment. "I think we earned it." She nodded, eyes misted. "Back then," she whispered, "I used to think I was the kind of woman people walked away from. That I was hard to love. Too quiet, too stubborn, too scarred. You're not," he said plainly. "You're steady and real and worth staying for." She leaned into him, their shoulders touching, their breathing in sync. "No one ever told me that before." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. The wind shifted through the trees then, but they didn't move. Not all homes have four walls. Sometimes a porch swing under stars and the weight of a trusted shoulder are enough. And sometimes everything. It had been months since James, the brother-in-law, last appeared. The memory of his visit had faded like a bruise, not forgotten, but no longer tender. Mara thought maybe the world beyond the trees had finally moved on. That maybe, just maybe, peace would be allowed to stay. But peace has a way of drawing attention. It began with a letter, folded neat, delivered by a ranch hand from a nearby outpost who had passed through town. To Mrs. Mara Collins, it read in scrawled ink. She hadn't used that name in nearly a year. She opened it slowly, sitting beneath the shade of the juniper where she and Tovani had first planted their sapling. The words were few but pointed. You've been seen. And there's talk. The boy still carries our name. That means something, legally. Don't think you can disappear forever. No signature. But she didn't need one. That evening, Mara handed the letter to Tovani. He read it once, then set it aside like ash. You want to run? He asked. She shook her head. I'm done running. Then we faced them. She looked into his eyes and saw no fear, only resolve. They rode into town together 2 days later. Tovani rarely entered town, but this time he made no protest. He rode beside her like a wall of calm shadow, one hand resting near the bow strapped to his saddle. Ben stayed at the cabin with a trusted friend of Tovani's, an elder with quiet eyes and a mind like a fox. In the sheriff's office, Mara placed the letter on the desk. The sheriff, a gray-bearded man with a reputation for neutrality, looked up from his chair. You know who sent this? I have an idea, she said, but I'm not here for names. I'm here to make sure they don't have a right to threaten me or my son. Tovani spoke next, quiet but firm. She and the boy live under my roof. They've harmed no one, and they aren't going anywhere. The sheriff nodded slowly, folding his hands. I've heard things, he said, but I've also seen the boy smiling in the market. That says more than gossip ever could. He looked directly at Mara. You're not breaking any laws. The boy is yours. No one has claim unless a judge says so, and I haven't heard of any court involved. Relief washed over her, but she stayed steady. Then that's all I needed to know. Back at the cabin that night, as she hugged Ben tight and watched the moon rise over the hills, she whispered into the soft dark of his hair, You are ours, not because someone said so, but because we chose each other. Tovani stood in the doorway watching her. You did good, he said. So did you. The next day they hung a wooden sign above the door to the cabin. Hand-carved by Tovani, painted by Ben with clumsy strokes of blue and yellow. It read, Chosen Place. Because this life wasn't given. It was chosen. And that made all the difference. Summer came in golden waves across the hills. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had become a living, breathing home. Every corner now held the fingerprints of their small, self-made family, Ben's drawings on the walls, Mara's dried herbs hanging from the beams, and Tovani's careful carvings resting on shelves or tucked into quiet corners like silent blessings. One afternoon, while laying out baskets of dried fruit for winter storage, Ben asked the question no one expected. Do I have a middle name? Mara paused, her hand still. She hadn't thought about it in years. Back then, when everything hurt and every step was about survival, there hadn't been time for small, tender things like names that carried meaning. I don't think I ever gave you one, she admitted softly. Ben's brow furrowed. Can I have one now? Tovani looked up from his carving, eyes thoughtful. Names matter, he said. But the ones you choose for yourself, those last longer than the ones you're given. That night, over a quiet dinner, they gave Ben his middle name. Ben Tocha Collins, a mix of English and Comanche. Tocha meant light after storm. Mara watched her son beam with pride as he repeated it over and over. Tovani didn't say much, but his chest rose a little deeper when Ben leaned against his side later and said, I like having both names. It's like I belong in two places. Mara looked at Tovani and said, No, you belong in one. Tovani glanced at her. Here, with us. In the weeks that followed, more people began to notice. It wasn't just that Mara had returned to town for supplies or that Tovani occasionally traded goods with local farmers. It was that they had become a unit, a family built on respect, care, and a fierce kind of love that didn't shout to be heard. When a storm rolled through and flooded part of the trail into town, it was Tovani and Ben who helped clear the path. When a neighbor's daughter went missing, it was Mara who rode out with others and helped find her, hidden and afraid. And for the first time in years, when people saw her, they didn't whisper. They waved. They asked how she was, how Ben was, how her man was. One evening, while sitting on the porch, Mara turned to Tovani. Do you ever regret letting us stay? He looked at her with steady, honest eyes. I never let you stay, he said. You arrived, and the world got quieter when you did. She reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together like branches weaving into shelter. No more running, she whispered. No more hiding, he replied. Their circle wasn't large. It didn't need to be. It held enough for love, enough for truth, enough for 3 people who had once been lost, and now were found. Autumn crept in slowly, blanketing the land with warm colors and cool winds. The trees turned amber, the sky deepened into crisp blue, and the nights once again called for thick blankets and a fire that never burned low. Mara loved this season the most, not because it was easy, but because it reminded her of the turning point. It reminded her of when everything changed. One morning, she found Ben sitting under the apple tree near the cabin, the one she and Tovani had planted together the previous spring. The boy traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, a small carving tucked in his lap. "What you thinking about?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Ben looked up. "I was thinking maybe when I grow up I'll live here too. I can build a second cabin. One real close." Mara smiled. "You planning that already?" Ben shrugged. "Feels right. This place feels like forever." Her throat tightened with emotion. "Me too, baby." Later that day, Tovani returned from a hunt with fresh venison and an unusually quiet expression. As they cleaned the meat together, he finally spoke. "A man I knew from long ago was at the trading post today," he said. "Asked about me, asked about you." Mara stopped working. "Someone from your past?" Tovani nodded. "Tribal elder. He said the stories had reached even far circles, that I'd taken in a woman and child, that we'd made a life." He looked at her. He wanted to know if it was true. Mara raised a brow. "And what did you say?" "I said no," Tovani said. Then his voice softened. "I said we didn't make a life. We found it." That night, with the fire casting shadows across the walls and Ben asleep in his bed, Mara and Tovani sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket. They listened to the wind move through the trees, the quiet of the land resting around them like a sigh. "I've been thinking," Mara said. "I want to teach again." Tovani looked at her. "I want to open a small schoolhouse," she continued, "for kids from here, from nearby homesteads, maybe even from your tribe, somewhere safe, somewhere kind." Tovani nodded slowly. "Then we'll build it." The next morning they marked the spot together, just beyond the orchard, near the bend in the path where the light always hit first in the morning. Ben helped too, planting a stick in the ground and declaring it the smartest dirt on the whole ranch. And just like that, the dream began. Not with a blueprint, not with a budget, but with belief, because some lives are found on the other side of pain. Some families are chosen with every sunrise, and some homes begin not with doors or roofs, but with a reason to stay. Construction on the schoolhouse began as the leaves turned gold and fell like memory over the land. Tovani cut timber by hand, shaping each beam with the same patience he once carved wooden animals for Ben. Mara drafted lessons by lantern light and stitched together cloth charts with her fingers still stained from harvest. Ben, determined to be part of history, painted the first sign, crooked letters and all. It read the Little Ridge Schoolhouse. No one said it aloud, but they all knew this wasn't just a classroom. It was a legacy. People came to help. A widowed seamstress from town brought old chairs. A rancher offered leftover shingles. A few mothers arrived with wide eyes and quiet questions about how soon their children could learn letters without the whipping. Mara welcomed them all. There were no conditions, no fees, just kindness. And word began to spread. One night, while hammering shingles under a sky splashed with stars, Tovani paused and looked down at Mara below. "You ever think this all started with one broken trail?" She looked up at him, hand shielding her eyes from moonlight. "I think it started the day you saw us, really saw us." He nodded. "Maybe, but I think it started the day you stood back up." Back inside, as the fire crackled and Ben recited the alphabet with absolute confidence, Mara reached into the drawer where she kept the old letter, the threat from her in-laws. She hadn't read it in months. She stared at it one last time, then tossed it into the hearth. It curled, blackened, and disappeared into ash. Tovani watched from across the room but didn't speak. He only nodded. As autumn neared its end, they held the schoolhouse's first gathering. No official ceremony, just families in wool coats, children holding jam jars and cornbread, and Ben standing tall beside his painted sign like a tiny sentry. When Mara rang the small brass bell, silence fell. She looked around, at parents who once feared their children wouldn't be welcomed, at neighbors who once doubted her, and at Tovani, who stood with arms crossed, eyes proud. "I came here once with nothing," she said, voice steady. "But I wasn't empty. I had a son. I had strength. And now, I have all of you." The applause wasn't loud, but it was real, and it echoed long after the bell stopped ringing. Later that night, back at the cabin, Ben fell asleep with ink smudges on his fingers and a book tucked under his chin. Mara whispered to Tovani by the fire, "We're leaving something behind now, something that will outlast us." He pulled her close. "We already have." The first snowfall of the year arrived not as a storm, but as a hush. It blanketed the land gently. covering the schoolhouse roof, the orchard trees, and the trail leading to town. The wind held its breath, and the world slowed down. Inside the cabin, Mara stirred a pot of stew while Ben sat cross-legged near the fire, carefully drawing in a notebook with furrowed brows. Tovani entered quietly, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Visitors?" Mara asked, eyes flicking toward the door. He shook his head. "Just the deer." She smiled. "Lucky deer." He glanced toward the boy. "What's he drawing?" Ben looked up. "A map." "To where?" Tovani asked. The child grinned. "To here." Later that evening, after supper and stories, after the lamps had been turned low and the fire whispered beneath the logs, Mara and Tovani stepped out into the snow-covered quiet. The stars above were clear, bright, and endless. She took his hand, fingers warm inside his. "You ever think about the stars?" she asked softly. He nodded. "All the time." "About how far away they are?" "No," he said. "About how they shine even when no one's watching." She smiled and leaned against him. "Sometimes," she said, "I think that's what you are. Steady, quiet, bright in your own way." He didn't respond with words, he just held her a little tighter. As the snow crunched beneath their feet, they walked toward the small rise where the schoolhouse stood. Moonlight lit the outline of the roof, the little sign swaying gently in the wind. Tovani paused. "I want to build something else," he said suddenly. She turned. "Another room?" He shook his head. "A home. A bigger one, with more space, for whatever comes next." Mara searched his face. "You're not just building it for us, are you?" "No," he said. "I'm building it for you. Because even if the world tries again to knock at our door, I want it to find walls we built together." She kissed him then. Not with urgency, but with depth. A kiss that said yes. Still yes. Always yes. When they returned to the cabin, the wind picked up slightly, whistling through the trees like a lullaby from the earth itself. Ben was already asleep, notebook open beside him, his map to here sketched with arrows and hearts and stars. Mara smiled as she pulled a blanket over him. Then she looked at Tovani and whispered, "We're not just surviving anymore." He nodded, voice low. "We're living." And somewhere beneath that vast, eternal sky, a once broken woman and a quiet hunter stood strong, no longer waiting to be accepted, no longer fearing the knock at the door, because they had built something no snow, no lie, no past could bury. A life chosen, a family found, a love earned. Winter deepened, and with it came both silence and reflection. The cabin stood strong against the snow, its windows glowing with the warm light of something built slowly, intentionally. Inside, laughter still rang, bread still baked, and stories still unfolded at the edge of firelight. But even in a house full of peace, the past sometimes found a way back in. It started with a letter, again, but this one was official, sealed with wax and stamped by the county clerk. Mara held it in shaking hands, breath held tight in her chest. Tovani opened it for her. "Notice of custody hearing. A petition has been filed by surviving paternal relatives of Benjamin Collins for legal guardianship, appearance required within 30 days. Mara sank into the nearest chair, heart pounding. "They're trying to take him," she whispered. Tovani's jaw tightened, eyes scanning the document again. "They're not going to," he said calmly. "But what if the judge—" "We'll go," he interrupted gently. "We'll stand before them. But this time, we don't go in broken. We go in whole." The following weeks were quiet but tense. Mara taught her lessons, Ben laughed as always, and the cabin remained full of small joys. But under the surface was a ripple of fear neither she nor Tovani could fully bury. One night, as the wind howled through the dark, she stood at the window, arms crossed tight. "They don't know him," she said. "Not like I do, not like you do." Tovani walked up behind her, wrapping her in his arms. "We don't have to prove love," he whispered. "We just have to show it." On the morning of the hearing, they left the cabin early. Mara wore her best wool coat. Ben wore a vest Tovani had sewn by hand. And Tovani wore no weapon, just calm strength and the silent history of a man who had lived through every kind of judgment and still stood tall. The courthouse smelled of old paper and cold wood. Inside, a woman with a tight bun and sharper words spoke on behalf of Mara's former in-laws. "She took him into dangerous lands, lives with a man outside her people. The boy's name, his birthright, has been changed without consent." Mara rose. "I didn't take my son," she said, voice steady. "I protected him. When they beat me, I didn't run. I escaped. When no one else would hold us, he did." She looked toward Tovani. "He taught Ben to be kind, to be strong, to be brave. That boy didn't lose a family. He found one." The room was silent. Even the judge blinked slowly. By the end of the hearing, nothing was said outright. No ruling made yet. But as they walked out, A quiet clerk slipped Mara a folded note. It read only, "You spoke like a mother, and that matters more than any name." Back at the cabin, Ben ran into the orchard, his laughter like wind chimes again. Mara leaned against the porch rail, exhausted but lighter. Tovani handed her a cup of warm cider and said, "Storm's past." She nodded. "And we're still standing, because family wasn't something written in law books. It was written in hands held, tears wiped, fears silenced, and promises kept. And theirs? It was carved into every beam of their home." Weeks passed after the hearing, and while no formal decision had yet arrived, life on the homestead carried on, sturdy, vibrant, unshaken in its love. The snow began to melt in slow rivulets down the hillside, revealing soft earth and green shoots pushing through. Spring was on its way, and with it change. One morning, Mara opened the mailbox near the edge of the property and found a new envelope. Plain, official, sealed. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she walked back to the cabin in silence, feeling the weight of months, years, press against the paper in her hands. Tovani met her on the porch. She looked at him, then slowly tore the seal. Inside were only a few lines. "Custody remains with Amara Collins. The court recognizes her as the sole legal guardian of Benjamin Collins." She read it twice, and then she dropped the letter, let out a breath that turned to a sob, and laughed through the tears. Tovani caught her before her knees gave out. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over." That evening they built a fire outside, just the three of them. Ben didn't fully understand the paperwork, but he could see the relief in his mother's face, the softness in Tovani's voice, the way the cabin glowed like it was celebrating. Mara lifted her son into her lap and pressed a kiss into his hair. "No one's taking you away," she murmured. "Not ever." Ben leaned into her. "I didn't think they could. We have us." Tovani placed another log on the fire. "We've built something stronger than fear," he said. "Now it's time to grow it." In the days that followed, Mara found herself dreaming again, not of escape, not of survival, but of tomorrow. She planted rows of wildflowers along the path to the schoolhouse. Tovani began drawing plans for a second cabin, one Ben might live in when he got older, or one that could welcome travelers who needed rest. And one day, as the trees budded and the wind warmed, Ben came running into the house breathless, cheeks pink with excitement. "There's a girl!" he shouted. "She's new! Her family just moved near the creek. She's never seen a school before." Mara smiled. "Then you'll have someone to show around." Ben nodded solemnly. "I already told her about the ant rules." That night, Mara and Tovani lay side by side beneath the stars, the blanket pulled high, the air cool but gentle. "You feel it?" she asked. He turned his head toward her. "What?" "Peace." He nodded. "And purpose." They had lived through the fire. They had stood through the storm. And now, as the world slowly warmed, they could finally bloom. Together. The rains came early that year, soft and steady, soaking the roots of everything they'd planted. The orchard blossomed in pale pinks. Wildflowers lined the trail to the schoolhouse like nature itself was applauding. Inside the cabin, Mara moved differently now, not as someone waiting for the past to knock again, but as a woman fully rooted. Her shoulders no longer carried weight they weren't meant to hold. Her smile came easier. Her silence no longer hid pain, only peace. Tovani noticed it. He noticed everything. One quiet afternoon, while Ben was at the creek with a group of new school friends, Mara stood beside the garden plot, inspecting early sprigs of mint. Tovani walked up behind her, clearing his throat awkwardly. She turned, wiping soil from her palms. "You look like you've got something to say." He held out a small wooden box. Nothing fancy. Smooth pine, carved edges. Simple. Honest. Like him. She opened it, and inside, nestled on soft cloth, was a silver band. No jewels, just a single engraving inside. "Found, chosen, loved." Mara stared down at it, then looked up, eyes wide and glassy. Tovani wasn't on one knee. He didn't need to be. "I know we've been a family for a long time now," he said softly. "But I want to make it known. I want to build the rest of this life with your name beside mine, not just here, but in every circle we walk into." Mara's lips trembled. "You're asking?" "I'm promising," he said. "But yes, I'm asking too." She didn't answer with words. She took his hand and slid the ring onto her own finger. They didn't announce a wedding. They invited neighbors for a celebration of seasons, and everyone showed up, carrying pies and wildflowers, honeycomb and stitched cloths. A Comanche elder offered a blessing in both English and his native tongue. A hymn was sung by the children of the schoolhouse, led by Ben, standing proud and tall with a sprig of rosemary pinned to his shirt. No aisle, no veil. Just Mara, barefoot in the grass, walking toward the man who had once opened his door to a stranger, and now opened his life to her, forever. That night, As the last guest departed and the fire burned low, Mara sat beside her husband, and listened to the quiet crackle of the world settling. "Do you regret we didn't do it the usual way?" she asked. Tovani looked at her. "We've never done anything the usual way." She laughed. "Still," she said, "it was perfect." He leaned in, kissed her brow, and whispered, "Because it was ours." Out beyond the orchard, fireflies flickered like soft stars pulled down to earth. The schoolhouse stood silent but strong, windows glowing with the echoes of children who believed in second chances. And in the house they had built together, with soil and sweat and love, a family rested, whole, at last. Years passed, not in a rush, but in a steady rhythm, like the beating of hooves on packed dirt, like wind through cedar branches, like a quiet song that never quite ends. Ben grew tall. His voice deepened. His sketches became plans, real ones, for fences, shelters, new trails. He took over more chores on the land, sometimes grumbling, but always finishing with pride. Mara still taught at the schoolhouse. Fewer students needed her now, but she remained, because she believed in what it stood for. Tovani became the kind of man others sought for guidance. Not loud, not boastful, just steady. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now echoed with life, love, and legacy. One spring morning, Mara stood in the orchard, fingers brushing the blossoms that had bloomed year after year. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent, faint and sweet, like a memory coming home. Tovani stepped up beside her. "Ben's heading into town," he said. "Wants to ask about land plots." Mara raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Tovani smiled. "Said he might build his own home near the creek. Said he wants to raise a family here, near us." Mara exhaled slowly, heart full. "We did it," she whispered. "We gave him roots." Tovani took her hand. "And wings." That evening they all sat around the fire, just like the old days. Ben told a story about getting kicked by a mule and exaggerated every detail. Mara laughed so hard she nearly spilled her cider. Tovani, quiet as always, watched them both with a peace so deep it felt sacred. And when the fire burned low, and the night pressed in gentle and cool, Ben looked at his parents and said, "Do you think people like us were meant to find each other?" Mara reached for Tovani's hand. "No," she said softly. "We weren't meant to. We chose to." And that made all the difference. They had come from pain, from exile, from silence. But they built something stronger than what broke them. A home not made of wood, but of grace. A family not written in blood, but in choice. And under the vast, endless western sky, they lived a life they carved with their own hands. Not perfect, but deeply, truly, beautifully their own.